Gun crime is spiraling out of control in Ontario and Quebec, and the numbers don't just raise eyebrows, they slap you in the face. Toronto, the crown jewel of Canada's urban centers, saw a jaw-dropping 65% spike in gun crime. That's right, a 65% surge in what's supposed to be one of the safest cities in the country. Quebec, always eager to join the chaos, isn't far behind. With violence spreading like wildfire, you'd think the Trudeau government might finally take aim at the real problem, criminals and the illegal firearm trade. But no, instead, they're pointing their guns at, wait for it, law-abiding Canadians. And it gets worse. Trudeau and his liberal cheerleaders aren't just bad at dealing with crime, they're bad at politics too. The Liberals are tanking in the polls, scraping the bottom of the barrel. You'd think plummeting popularity might inspire them to actually fix the problem, but their big idea is to ban another 324 firearms. Yes, 324 more firearms, adding to the 1,500 they already outlawed in 2020. Because apparently, the Liberal playbook says if something isn't working, do it harder. In this video, we're cutting through the noise to show you why this new ban is pure political theater. It's not about keeping Canadians safe. It's about Trudeau saving face with his urban voter base. We'll dig into the stats that reveal the real source of gun crime, illegal firearms flooding in from the U.S. We'll show you why this ban punishes responsible gun owners, people who've jumped through every hoop, followed every rule, and posed zero threat to public safety. Meanwhile, actual criminals get a free pass, and gun violence continues to rise. If you're tired of politicians blaming the wrong people and refusing to deal with the real problem, stick around. This isn't just about Canada. It's about the broader assault on responsible gun ownership everywhere. Let's get into it. Gun crime in Canada is skyrocketing, and the numbers don't lie. Ontario, the land of politeness, hockey, and Tim Hortons, reported 4,791 firearm-related violent crimes in 2022, a jaw-dropping 24% increase from the previous year. Leading the pack is Toronto, where over half of these incidents occurred. Let that sink in. More than 2,400 firearm-related crimes in a city that loves to tout its safety. Toronto's rate of firearm-related violent crimes surged 36%, reaching 43.2 incidents per 100,000 people. You'd think that'd spark some serious reflection on how to deal with crime. But no, Trudeau's brain trust apparently thinks legal gun owners, not gangs, smugglers, or career criminals, are the real culprits. Quebec, not to be outdone, also has its share of bad news. While the province reported 1,994 firearm-related violent crimes in 2022, a rate of 24.8 incidents per 100,000 people, the story doesn't end there. Sure, that's technically a slight decrease from the previous year, but look at Gatineau. This charming riverside city decided to set a record with a 76% rise in gun crime. Yep, a 76% jump. And they want you to believe stricter gun laws are working. Funny how the numbers say otherwise. Here's the kicker. These were once regions celebrated as Canada's safest. Ontario and Quebec, the provinces where kids rode bikes till sundown and people rarely locked their doors, are now grappling with surging violence. The myth of safety has been thoroughly shattered, exposing how liberal policies have left communities vulnerable. What's worse is that this crime wave isn't coming from farmers or sports shooters. It's driven by criminals exploiting weak borders and ineffective enforcement. Still, the government's grand solution is to double down on targeting law-abiding gun owners. Brilliant, isn't it? Canadians aren't buying the nonsense anymore, and it's showing in the polls. The Liberal Party, once the darling of urban elites, is polling at a humiliating 22%. their lowest in decades. Even their die-hard supporters in Toronto and Montreal are starting to ask questions. And with this level of incompetence, who can blame them? Instead of addressing smuggling, organized crime, or the actual causes of gun violence, Trudeau's government clings to the same tired script. Punish the good guys, while crime continues to spiral out of control. He does this by again banning 324 more firearm models. That's right, 324 more, tacked onto the 1,500 they already outlawed in 2020. If you think that sounds like progress, think again. Critics are calling this yet another hollow move that focuses on punishing law-abiding gun owners while ignoring the actual criminals causing the chaos. Meanwhile, the real problem, illegal firearms flooding across the U.S.-Canada border, remains untouched. The absurdity of this strategy is hard to overstate. By zeroing in on legally owned firearms, Trudeau's administration is not only missing the mark, but also actively eroding public trust. Canadians aren't blind to the fact that most gun crimes involve smuggled weapons, not rifles locked away in law-abiding citizens' safes. You know how it is with these liberal leftoids. Instead of addressing the glaring issues, they double down on policies that pander more to their urban anti-gun voter base. Meanwhile, there's actually zero attempt to curb violence. This approach begs the question, how can you effectively combat gun violence when you're not even targeting the root cause? Trudeau's government is sidestepping the real problem and shifting blame onto the very people who follow the law. For decades, Canada's legal firearm owners have been subjected to increasing restrictions, all in the name of public safety. Yet, data consistently shows that these individuals are rarely involved in gun-related crimes. According to Statistics Canada, legal firearms are rarely used by their registered owners to commit crimes. In 2022, police services reported nearly 14,000 firearm-related violent crimes, accounting for 2.8% of all violent crimes that year. However, the majority of these incidents involved illegally obtained firearms. This raises a critical question. Why does the government persist in targeting law-abiding citizens while the real sources of gun violence remain unaddressed? The logic behind these policies is fundamentally flawed. It's akin to banning bank withdrawals to prevent robberies, punishing those who follow the law instead of focusing on the actual perpetrators. By cranking up the rules and red tape on lawful gun owners, our government is basically dodging the real elephant in the room: the illegal guns that criminals actually use to commit most shootings. All this does is undermine faith between everyday Americans and the folks in charge. Instead of protecting anyone, these over-the-top restrictions just stir up resentment and mistrust. You only have to look at what happened in Canada after their big 2020 gun ban to see how pointless this approach can be. They threw a huge chunk of taxpayer money at banning over 1,500 firearm models. And for what? Crime stats barely budged. Plenty of critics point out that this sure looks more like political showmanship than a real effort to keep anyone safer. It's like they're hoping we won't notice that their big plan isn't actually doing squat about the real threats. If these particular firearms were such a menace, you'd figure crime rates would drop once they were banned, right? But guess what? We're looking at a 65% jump in gun crime, driven entirely by firearms smuggled in by criminals who have zero regard for any laws on the books. Meanwhile, the government just keeps adding more bad guns to the blacklist. Does that slow down the crooks? Nope. It only hurts ordinary people who follow the rules, leaving the real problem, illegal guns, completely ignored. Focusing endlessly on folks who obey the law is a slick way to avoid dealing with the messy, complicated world of smuggled guns. By going after legal owners, our leaders sidestep the real fight against criminal supply lines. This kind of strategy won't bring down gun violence. It just chips away at the rights of responsible firearm owners and draws attention away from the true source of trouble. As we dig deeper, it's pretty obvious that the core issue isn't legal gun owners at all. What's really fueling violent crime up in Canada isn't the rifle sitting in some law-abiding citizen's gun safe. It's the flood of smuggled firearms slipping right past current policies. The government strategy, which seems overly focused on cracking down on people who play by the rules, has failed to seriously tackle the illegal flow of guns. That should worry anyone who cares about actually reducing violence rather than just scoring political points. Canada's been wrestling with a spike in gun violence, and all signs point to one major culprit: smuggled firearms. According to law enforcement, a hefty chunk of the guns used in crimes are sneaking in from abroad, especially from the United States. Even the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, admits that the black market is pumped full of illegal guns crossing the border. It's no secret that these smuggled weapons pose a huge danger to everyday people, yet the official response still feels way off target. Despite the crystal-clear link between smuggled firearms and rising crime rates, the Canadian government has been taking a beating from critics who argue that it just isn't doing enough to disrupt these smuggling pipelines. Sure, proposals like Bill C-21 talk about tougher penalties for trafficking and smuggling, but the real action seems stuck on stripping more rights from legal gun owners. By pouring energy into limiting the freedoms of responsible citizens, the authorities let smuggling rings keep humming along, barely touched. If we actually want to make communities safer, it's time for a change in tactics. Beefing up border security, both in manpower and in high-tech surveillance tools, could go a long way towards spotting and seizing illegal guns before they hit the streets. Ramping up the presence of well-trained personnel at key checkpoints would choke off the supply before these weapons ever land in criminal hands. On top of that, hammering organized crime groups that orchestrate these smuggling operations is essential. We need closer teamwork between federal and provincial law enforcement agencies, working hand in hand to bring down the networks fueling this black market. By finally prioritizing the crackdown on illegal firearms, we can start curbing the violence that's tearing at public safety without undermining the rights of honest, law-abiding gun owners. Sadly, Canada's Liberal government isn't exactly banning guns for the sake of banning guns. It's doing it to play to its urban base in Toronto and Montreal, where support for gun control is strong and opposition to private gun ownership is almost reflexive. These urban centers, deeply embedded in the Liberal Party's voter base, see guns as a cultural taboo rather than tools of self-defense or recreation. It's no coincidence that polling consistently shows a higher appetite for gun restrictions in these areas compared to rural communities, where firearms are woven into the fabric of daily life. This urban bias is amplified by the influence of progressive ideologues who shape the government's narrative on gun control. Activists and organizations, like the Coalition for Gun Control, push the idea that restricting legal ownership is the ultimate solution to gun violence, conveniently ignoring the role of smuggled firearms in organized crime. This ideological framework assumes that tighter gun laws are a one-size-fits-all fix, ignoring evidence that legal gun owners contribute minimally to crime statistics. Such policies often reflect urban anxieties about gun culture rather than the reality of rural and small-town life. The government strategy goes beyond ideological missteps. It's a calculated smokescreen. By announcing sweeping gun bans, Trudeau's administration can deflect attention from its failure to address the real drivers of violence, such as smuggled firearms. These bans are headline-grabbing gestures designed to make it seem like action is being taken, all while the real criminals, armed with weapons trafficked across the U.S.-Canada border, continue their activities unabated. The result? A policy that punishes law-abiding citizens while leaving the root causes of crime untouched. The political theater doesn't come without risks. By vilifying legal firearm owners, the Liberals risk alienating rural voters who view these measures as an attack on their rights and way of life. In rural Canada, firearms are more than just tools. They're a part of the culture used for hunting, farming, and protecting livestock. This urban-rural divide is being deepened by policies that prioritize appeasing city-based progressives over fostering national unity. Even moderate voters are beginning to see the policy for what it is: a distraction, not a solution. But that's it for this video. Canada's escalating gun crime, fueled by smuggled firearms, highlights the Liberal government's failure to address the real problem. Instead, Trudeau targets legal gun owners with ineffective bans, using political theater to distract from rising violence. These policies cater to urban progressive ideologues while alienating rural Canadians who rely on firearms for daily life. Billions wasted on bans and crackdowns do nothing to stop criminal networks or secure borders. What do you think of Trudeau's genius idea? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more.